Hola gente del grupo Grite, ¿cómo están? Nuevamente con un invitado especial. Antes que nada, agradecerle a Pablo que esté de vuelta con nosotros para ayudarnos en la traducción y en las discusiones, agregando siempre su impronta, más como escritor de terror, porque hoy tenemos nada más ni nada menos que a Stephen Jones. Cuando uno habla de literatura de terror, piensa en novelistas, piensa en cuentistas, pero muchos de esos novelistas, muchos de esos cuentistas no los conoceríamos si no fuera gracias a las antologías que gente como Stephen Jones han publicado a lo largo de décadas. Es ahí donde uno empieza a conocer a cuentistas, novelistas que de otra manera quizás no conocería. Y es ahí cuando uno lee ese cuento especial que dice, me encantó este cuento, voy a buscar más de este autor. Ese trabajo lo hace, entre otras personas, Stephen Jones desde hace décadas, publicando algunas de las mejores antologías publicadas en inglés. Así que es para nosotros un verdadero honor to have Stephen Jones with us. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you for asking me.
All right. Fernando, make a small introduction of yours, saying that you are one of the pillars of the anthologizers of the best horror uh, short stories, or not so short, about where you really find a fine actor, a fine actor, a fine writer, and you say, I do like this one. There is behind somebody that chosen this writer. So the work of the invisible work of the editor and the publisher is the main thing that is the glue, but a glue with life that is like parla. Remember, as Michelangelo say to the statue. So that's the opening words of Fernando about your great, incredible contribution to the genre.
I
No,
don't, to be honest, I don't find it incredible. It's my job. It's what I do day by day in, day out, because I've loved it since I was a kid, since I was a child. And I've loved horror since I was a child. And I'm very grateful and very blessed that I can still do it even at my age. You know, I've been doing this now for nearly 50 years. I've been doing it professionally. And I'm getting close to 200 books now. Not all anthologies, some are non-fiction books and some are movie books and things like that as well. But I go to work in my office, which you can see behind me here. I go to work pretty much every day, 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. And all I do is horror or movies or things like that. And I can't ask for a better job than that. It is just a lovely, lovely life. And all the people I've met, and many of them you guys have interviewed in the past, um, for the most part, not everyone, obviously, but for the most part, the people in our community, both here in England, in America, and in Europe, all over the world, have turned out to be really, really nice people to work with. And you know, you don't often find that people actually enjoy going to work in the morning. But for me, I can think of no better job, and it's what makes me get up and work and do another book and another book and another book. And it's I'm blessed. You know, not many of us can say that, but I'm actually blessed at what I do. So I don't see it as work. I see it as just a lovely life. And I go to conventions in America, and I go to conventions over here, and I used to be a movie reviewer, and I've worked on movies in the past. I worked on Hellraiser and other movies like that. So I've got to travel all over the world. I've got to meet incredible people. I've got to work with incredible people. And yeah, it's just, I actually have the best life in the world that I could imagine, which I could not have imagined when I first discovered horror when I was a child. I could never imagine doing this. So I'm very, very lucky.
And
How did you begin your work as a anthology um, compiler?
I began, yeah, okay. I began as a reader, like everybody else, as a child. I used to read comics. Then I moved up to horror magazines, Famous Monsters of Filmland and Castle of Frankenstein. These were horror movie magazines in the 1960s. And then from there, I discovered science fiction books by Arthur C. Clarke and Edgar Rice Burroughs and people like that, and fantasy books by Robert E. Howard and Lynn Carter. And then one day I was in a department store and I found a book by a guy called H.P. Lovecraft, who I'd never heard of. And I picked up the book. It was called Dagon, and it was a collection of his short stories. And I love the book. I still love H.P. Lovecraft to this day, and I still publish him. But I love the introduction to the book by his friend August Derleth. And August Derleth talked about in the introduction how all these people got together around Lovecraft. You would have Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, all these people who knew him at the time and worked with him, and they were friends, and they would go to each other's houses, and they would go out together when they met up when they were in town. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing. It never occurred to me as a boy growing up in London in the late 1960s that writers did this. They would meet their editors at an office or a restaurant or a bar, and it really fired up my imagination about what being a writer was like. And then when a couple of years later I left school and I went to work, I started reading fanzines, the magazines put together by the fans.
Yes.
And from there, I discovered an advert in the back of one of them for a group called the British Fantasy Society in this country, which is very early days for them. And it's like you were saying, it's a group of crazy people who love fantasy and horror and science fiction. And so I got involved with them. And through that, I started meeting writers. One of the first of whom I met was Ramsey Campbell, who took me under his wing, looked after me, gave me lots of advice. And from that, I started doing little magazines, little fanzines, but to a good quality. I myself and another gentleman called David Sutton did a magazine called Fantasy Tales. Well, there was nothing like that in England at the time. It had color covers. We published Brian Lumley, Ramsey Campbell, Michael Moorcock. All these guys would send us stories. And so I learned my craft doing those kind of little magazines. And we were at a convention one evening in the late 80s, I guess. And a publisher was there, and he came up to us and he said, "Have you ever thought of doing a book of the best stories from your magazine?" And I said, "No." In fact, we had been trying for years to do it, and nobody was interested. Nobody would. We'd send out the manuscripts, and we had all these big names in the manuscript, and they would just send it back. And they'd say, "Yeah, very good, but there's no market for it. We can't sell it." And this guy said, "Well, look, send me a manuscript, and if I like it, I'll publish it." And his name was Nick Robinson, and he was just starting a company called Robinson Publishing at the time. He owned the company. And so we got what we'd been sending out, made it look a little bit nicer, sent it off to him. He accepted it straight away. And so the first proper anthology I did was a book called The Best of Fantasy Tales, which came out in 1988. And has been translated into Spanish, by the way, in Spain. It was translated into Spanish back then. And then that's what started everything rolling from that point onwards. The same year, Kim Newman and I did Horror 100 Best Books, which
Yes.
was a non-fiction anthology, if that's what you want to call it, where we got 100 of the top writers of the time to choose their favorite horror book and explain why. And that's still a book I'm very proud of today. It was a fabulous book, and I would love to see it in schools being used as a textbook to teach children and young people the best books you can go out and buy and read. And then it just one thing led to another. Nick Robinson said, would you do some more books for us in our Mammoth Book series, which is a book of big fat paperbacks, which you were just showing some copies of there, Fernando. And we did vampires and Frankenstein and zombies and werewolves, and there's the Frankenstein one, yeah. Which has also been translated into Spanish, by the way. And then they asked me, would I be interested in doing a yearly best of anthology? And we didn't have that in this country. We had it for science fiction, but we didn't have it for horror. So I said, well, let me see if Ramsey Campbell will do it with me. And Ramsey said, yes, that sounds great. We would do it. Our friend Carl Edward Wagner was doing something in America that was very similar at the time. So we asked him if it would be okay if we did one in England. And Carl very kindly said, yes, that's fine. Go ahead, guys. And then, of course, Ellen Datlow was doing one in America a little bit later on as well. So we started doing Best New Horror every year. Ramsey, I think, lasted 4 or 5 volumes and just gave up. He said, "There's just too much work. It's too much reading." And this was in the 1980s and 1990s, and that's when the market exploded. It was huge all over the world, and it was a full-time job. I mean, all this stuff was coming in. We had to read magazines and books and manuscripts and things. It was all reprint, so at least it had all gone through some system beforehand. It had been seen beforehand. And I did that for 31 years. I did that book, and every year, it became such hard work because, as I explained to someone not long ago, basically it was an annual anthology that took me 18 months to do because there was so much work on it. So the schedule started to slip and everything else. So in the end, I decided I wanted to end it on my own terms. And we had a series here back in the 1960s and 70s called the Pan Book of Horror Stories. I don't know if you're aware of that. It was a very early anthology series put out by Pan Books in England. And they had the record of having published the longest running consecutive horror anthology series in England. And they ran to 30 volumes. So I said, I'm going to run to 31 volumes and I'm going to win. And that's what I did. I did 31 volumes and said, no more. I'm done on that. I've got enough other things to do. So we actually hold the record. We now have the record of the longest running horror anthology series, possibly in the world, actually. And then there's so many other books I've wanted to do over the years. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that, time is short. And so I wanted to get on with other things. And that's what I'm doing now. But I've never stopped doing anthologies. I've just had 2 come out this year at Halloween. I did stop for a while because I was burned out. I mean, Best New Horror just burned me out. But I've done all sorts of anthologies in all sorts of different areas of the genre, both in America and in Britain, and then they've been reprinted all over the world. And it's fun, it's interesting, but I've always tried to explain it to people that it's like making a movie, because my background is television and movies. I began working in the television industry in this country, making documentaries and TV commercials and things. So I think of the editor as being the director. And that's the person who moves everything around and gives it the flow and the beat and the highs and the lows, because you can't have all the stories the same. You have to have a story like this and a little bit more gentle story, and then maybe a horror story. You've got to open with something really, really good to get the reader interested, and you've got to end with something really, really good on an upbeat note. So if you think of it, it's like putting a movie together. That's how a movie is constructed. So the stories are the scenes or the sequences, and you've got to make it flow and build and whatever. So if the stories are the sequences and the editor is the director, then the writers, the authors, they are the actors. So you're trying to get the best actors you can get involved, and the bigger names, the better chance you have of selling the book. And then the publisher is the producer or the film company. They are the people who put the package together, make it look lovely, and then send it out there, and hopefully it sells some copies or whatever. And I've always looked at the way I construct books that way. And the analogy seems to work. It seems to work very well. So yeah, I see myself, especially with the anthologies, as a director, and my job is to bring all these things together and try and create. I'm not even going to use the word art, because I wouldn't describe any of this as art. It's entertainment, and I absolutely do think of it as entertainment. I want to entertain people. I want to give them the best stories, the best writers, the best looking books, the best covers. That's why I design most of my own covers now. I have done for the last 20 years. I'll put the covers together and write the copy on the back, write all the words on the back. And I want it to be the best looking package it can possibly be. And then it goes out there, and then who knows what happens to it. Sometimes it sinks and sometimes it swims. That's, you never can tell. I've had books I've adored that have done nothing. And I've books that I've knocked out because somebody wanted me to do a book about vampires or something, and it's still selling today, 30 years later. You just can't tell.
Yes. I wish we would.
Entonces, Pablo, debemos entender que Best New Horror llegó hasta el número 31 y ya no va a haber más.
We are right if as we understood that the best horror finish end at the 31st volume, and there will be no more.
No more?
Oh, what about you?
No more. I mean, Ellen Datlow is still doing her best new horror or her best horror stories. The problem is, as I said, there's too much out there now, and especially with the internet and all this and print on demand and self-published stuff and whatever, it's just too much to do for one person to do every year. I also don't think we need it anymore. I think it's interesting. Publishing has changed since I started in publishing in the 1980s. We were selling thousands, tens of thousands of books a year of one title. And you would go into a bookstore in America or a bookstore in England, and there would be 10 of your books on the shelf, and then another 10 of a different title. Nowadays, you're lucky to find one copy on the shelf. And if that copy sells, they may replace it or they may not replace it. So most people get their books through Amazon now.
Oh.
Or they buy it off websites on on the internet. So the whole way books are published is very, very different from when I started out. The numbers are very different. So I get less for a book now than I used to get 30 years ago, because it sells fewer copies. And one of the ways I tried to get some money back for the book is by selling foreign rights, is by having different countries buy it, and they'll do their edition, and they'll pay a little bit of money towards the book, and then another country will buy it and they'll pay a little bit of money towards the book, and hopefully at the end of the day that book will earn enough money that it earns out, because I pay everybody up front. I mean, everybody gets paid before the book comes out. And I think it's very important. My friend Harlan Ellison once said to me, he said, I don't care what you pay me for a story, Steve, but you've got to pay me at least something. And I thought that was very good advice. And I've always done that. I also have something called royalties. Do you understand what royalties are with a book?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
So
of
that,
course.
of course.
yeah, so when a book sells and it makes more money than I get paid, I make some more money, and then that's shared between me and the authors. So if a book is successful, everybody earns a bit more money from it and goes on. And this can go on for decades. And I'm still paying money on books I did 40 years ago. They're still earning money. And as an editor, and I assume as a publisher, that's what you're looking for. You're looking, I'm not an actor, so I won't be immortal by being seen in a film long after I'm dead. But I hope when I'm dead and gone, people will still find my books on a bookstall somewhere in a secondhand bookstore or somewhere and pick it up and read it and enjoy it, because that's a kind of immortality. And
No,
that's all we can hope for as writers and editors. That's all we can hope for, is that in years to come, people are still finding our stuff and reading our stuff. I hope that's true. It was more true 10 years ago than it is now, but I'm hoping that books will survive in one form or another, physical books. I'm not a fan of ebooks. I understand why people want to read them. That's fine. But I've always had a policy that if you want to do an ebook of mine, you have to have a physical book as well. There must be available a physical book, a physical copy as well. Because I see, look at both of you, your house is your places are filled with books. My house is filled with books. This is just magazines mostly behind me here, but yeah, we are book people. We love books. We love the smell of
Yes.
books, the feel of books, the touch of books, the look of books. And I feel I don't know what it's like with you, but here libraries are closing down. Schools don't have books anymore. It's all done with tablets and computers and phones and everything else. So I fear we are losing that love of books. Our young people are losing that love of books. So I'm very, very particular. When I do a book, I want it to look as good as possible, and I want it to be as economical as possible so people can afford it. Because there's no point doing a book and it's priced out of people's income, and people all over the world are struggling these days, and money and fuel, money for fuel and food and rent and all this kind of stuff. It's very difficult. So with all my publishers, I try to make them price a book at the best rate, because we want to sell those books so people read them and then come back again. So that's my work ethic, basically, and my business model. I don't know whether it's a good business model or a bad business model, but it's the way I work.
Excellent, excellent. Fernando.
Pablo, interrumpime si necesitas después preguntar algo. Um,
Sí.
Quería consultarle, teniendo en cuenta que ha dedicado su vida a recopilar antologías, ¿cuáles son las que ha disfrutado más? Si las de Mammoth Best New Horror o de los Mammoth temáticos. No sé si se entiende la pregunta. Las recopilaciones de los mejores cuentos del año o los libros temáticos, por ejemplo, vampiros, historia de Frankenstein, historia de Wolfman, etc.
Yes, Fernando said that you have gathered an extraordinarily broad range of stories, annual selections, author inspired volumes, and of course, the Mammoth collections. If pressed to favor one of from above the rest, which would say offer the greatest intellectual pleasure? That's the question, isn't it?
Yes.
Fair.
Do you
Okay, yeah,
prefer
that's fine.
thematic collections or best
Right,
new horror?
I get it. That's fine. The thematic ones, vampires, Frankenstein's, werewolves, zombies, all of that, they're
For
fun to
horror?
do. Yeah, they're fun to do. but they are not the best books. But what they do allow me to do, or did allow me to do, was bring a lot of older or obscure stories back into print that were not in print at the time, or people might not be aware of. I'm a big collector. I have many magazines, Weird Tales and pulp magazines and things like that. I have lots of old anthologies going right back to the 1920s and beyond. Um, and it's fun to go and find these stories, or even find old stories by writers who are still around, like Ramsey Campbell or Brian Lumley, and reprint some of their older work. I was very lucky at the time growing up and going to conventions when I was just in my early 20s. And I got to meet a lot of these writers who were still alive at the time. So I used to be friends with people like Robert Bloch or Fritz Leiber or Manuel Wellman, Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson. These are all people who were my friends. I went to their house. Some of them came to my house. We would hang out together. I would work with them as friends and as colleagues. And I was very lucky, very blessed to be able to do that. But it meant that when I put together a themed anthology, I could just write to Robert Bloch and say, Bob, can I reprint this story or can I reprint that story? And the same with all of them. And so it was building up contacts. It was building up ways of knowing these people, of seeing them, of even just buying them a drink at a convention and just in the bar and just chatting to them or getting something signed. And so I found those are the easiest books for Nando to do. They were the easy ones. A much harder job is doing the non-themed anthologies. Now, we carried on. David Sutton and I carried on the Pan Book of Horror Stories for another 6 or 7 volumes. Then we did Dark Voices. Then we did Dark Terrors. I've recently revived an anthology series in this country, New Writings in Horror and the Supernatural,
Yes.
which is all brand new original stories, because it's very important to me as an editor to not only put good stories out into the market by established names, but also to bring up the younger writers and give them a chance. Maybe it'll be their 3rd or 4th story they've had published, but maybe the first one they've ever got paid real money for and been in a hardcover or a limited signed slipcase boxed edition or something. So it's very important to give the young, newer writers a chance and put them side by side with the older, more experienced writers. But doing that's a much harder anthology, because you've got to work very, very hard to make sure that all the stories are of a certain level, because this is the first time they've been published. It's the first time people will have read them. I want that to look as good as possible because it's my name on the spine of the book. It reflects upon me. But it's also the most rewarding, because once you've done that, you've created something new. It's like coming up with a new idea, it's a new thing. Whereas the other books, the themed anthologies, tend to be, a book of ghost stories, a book of Christmas stories, a book of Halloween stories, a book of, all these things I've done, book of folk horror stories. And they're great fun to do. But it's the newer stuff, the new anthologies, which I think are more challenging and at the end of the day, more important. But then on top of that, I also do these non-fiction books. And to me, those are the most important things. I've done the art of horror movies, the art of pulp horror, videotapes from hell. I'm working on another big coffee table color book about horror comics, which will be coming out in 2027. I'm putting together non-fiction books about other things. I did a book a couple of years ago called The Weird Tales Boys, which was about the connection between H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith, which has gone down very, very well. I mean, people love that book because it explained how, and again, it goes back to that article I read of that very first Lovecraft book I ever got back in the 1960s, how their lives all fitted together and they all crossed over and they worked for the same magazines and they read each other's manuscripts and they promoted each other. And I loved that. I wanted to tell that story. And so the Weird Tales Boys was a way I could come in and do a lovely book about how these guys were all friends and colleagues and they all helped each other. And I say that's what attracted me to the genre of 40, 50 years ago. And it was a way of giving something back. So I suspect I would say I'm most proud as not as an editor, although I've done more editing than anything else, but as a non-fiction writer. I've done a lot of non-fiction, a lot of it in movies. I've done tie-in books to movies. I've done guides to movies, that kind of stuff. And that's what makes me the proudest, I think. But that's the other thing is with my career, because I'm not a novelist or I'm not a short story writer. I work with some of the best. I work with Stephen King. I used to work with James Herbert. I work with all these people. Why would I try and pretend I'm as good as them? I'm not. But what I am good at is I'm good at non-fiction. I'm good at putting things together and seeing a pattern. And so I really enjoy doing those kinds of books, but they take 2 years to do. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of picture research, which I do all of that. But I'm most proud of those books. But it keeps me interested. I'll do an anthology, an original anthology, or a themed anthology. I've just done a young adult anthology, the second in a series of young adult books called Scary Stories to Tell at Night. The previous one was called Terrifying Tales to Tell at Night for an American publisher. And that's given me a chance to do stories for children who are probably between 11 and 14, that sort of age group, and introduce them to Ramsey Campbell or other writers they may not know, and put new stories in there as well. So I'm taking that module that I did for adults and adult readers and now trying to give it to younger people so they get interested at an earlier age, so that if they do go on to become teenagers and keep reading, they might go, oh, I really like that Ramsey Campbell story, or that story by Kim Newman, or that story by whoever. I'll go and find their books and read their books, and that might take them up another level, and so on. So what I try to do, I think I'm saying, is I try to challenge myself with different projects. I try to do different things. It keeps me interested. It keeps my career going, doing all these different things for different people. And at the end of the day, it means I'm not just doing the same thing over and over and over again. I'm doing something that keeps me wanting to come back to my desk every morning.
Great.
Did you yourself trace the old copyrights, or the publisher do that?
I do everything. Yeah, I do everything. A lot of editors have the publisher do all of that work. They say, oh, I want 14 stories in a book. Here they are. Now go away and find out who owns the copyrights, or whether whoever wherever they is. I've never done that. I've done everything. I find the stories. I contact the authors or the agents or the estates. I do the contracts. I do the deals. I do the royalties. I do everything. Because when I do a contract, the contract is with me. It's not with the publisher. It's a contract with me. Because that means even if that book goes out of print, the rights revert to me, and I can sell them again years down the line. And again, that was a piece of advice that Nick Robinson gave me very early in my career and my relationship with him. He said, Steve, never, if you can, sign the copyright to your work away. He said, because when you're older, it's something you will have, and it's like a pension. It's like something that will keep you earning money. And he was absolutely right. I'm still earning money off of books I did 20, 30 years ago. And it's great when you can do that. I have done some books for hire, is what we call it. So basically I get paid a flat fee. I never see any more money. and the publisher owns the rights to those books. And that's fair enough. I know that going in. I know that when I sign the contract, but it's probably because it's a book I want to do or project I want to do, and I'm willing to do that for that project. But most of the times, no, I do everything. As I say, I even write the copy on the back of the book, and I design the cover. I do. I'm a one-man industry. The only thing I don't do is publish. I have co-published stuff with people to get things into print. Not mine, mostly other people's work. But I try to leave the publishing side of things to people who have, know what they're doing in that respect. I don't have time to, print the books and distribute the books and store the books and anything else. But everything else, yeah, I do the copyrights. I have a file on every single book I've ever done. It's got all the contracts in it. It's got all the correspondence. It's got all the different versions of the book, whatever. So if somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, we'd like to reprint this book or translate this book," I can go to that file, and all the history of the book is in that file, and I can go, "Yes, we have the rights to that. We can sell you those rights." And then the trouble is, of course, having done these books for so many years now, a lot of the people I did those deals with are dead, or they've moved, or they've gone away, or whatever. So tracking people down is very difficult now. I just did royalties this summer for 2 anthologies, and it was a lot of money. I don't know what it would work out with you guys. It was I paid out around about £10,000 in royalties over 2 books.
It's a lot of money here.
It's for books that have been out and they've earned money before. These people have already had money from these books 2 or 3 times, and this was, another lot of money had built up. But the hard work was finding the people to pay and tracking them all down. It took me 3 months to track everybody down and make sure everybody had been paid. That's hard work. That was, and this is just wanting to pay people. This is not wanting to do a new book or anything. This is just having to pay people. But I've tried to be in my career very ethical. I try to be very ethical. I try to be as honest as I can, as upfront as I can with my writers, with my publishers, with everybody. I do not suffer fools gladly. If you're an idiot, you start messing me around, or you don't pay me and whatever, I will come down on you. I will really come down on you, because I think it's unfair. And it has happened to me. I've had publishers who've reneged on deals or not paid over the years, that kind of thing. It doesn't happen very often, but it has happened. But in my business dealings and my creative dealings, I try to be as fair, as honest, and as upfront with people as I possibly can. When I do these online interviews, these video interviews, I say to people, and they say, "Well, should we send you the questions beforehand?" And I say, "No, I don't want to know the questions beforehand. You just ask me your questions, and I will answer any question as honest and as forthright as I can be." And I do that when I'm on panels at conventions as well. I don't want to know what you're going to ask me. Just ask me anything, and I will tell you the truth as I know it, as best as I know it. And I think if you can do that, you're pretty much invincible. You can get away with anything, because it's part of what I do. I've always been like that. My parents brought me up to tell the truth and be honest, and I've tried to do that in all my business dealings. And yes, sometimes things do go wrong. Sometimes mistakes are made, or things happen that you don't foresee. In which case, I just tell people, I tell the writers, "Oh, the book's been delayed, or the book's been cancelled, or something's happened. But don't worry, we'll sort it out, and we'll get it sorted, and we'll work our way through it. And then eventually it all turns out right. We make it right." And sometimes when we've had a few bigger problems where maybe a book's been cancelled, I've still paid all the writers out of my own money. I haven't got the money from the publisher. I've paid them out of my own money. So they're not out of pocket. And then I've tried to sell that project somewhere else to get that money back. And most of the time that's worked. I mean, I don't have any books that have never sold. They've all eventually sold somewhere. That's all. I mean, I know I've had problems with Russia, not even recently. I used to sell a lot of books to Russia, but with the invasion of Ukraine, that has stopped. I don't sell any books to Russia at all anymore. But even before the Russians invaded Ukraine, they were reprinting my books and not sending me copies and not paying me. And so it was like the Wild West. So in some cases, and these were big publishers, these were real publishers who paid in American dollars and everything else. But I had friends in Russia and in Ukraine who would say, well, do you know this has just come out from them? Or do you know they've just done a reprint of this edition? And I went, no, they haven't told me. They haven't told the British publishers or the American publishers. And so I just stopped dealing with Russia. But all the other countries, yeah, I say Brazil, Italy, Spain, you know, I do deals with Poland, all these people, and it's great. And it's great to see a book in a different language and get to different people. And most of the time I don't charge a lot for that. I want to get copies of the books so that I can send them to all the authors, because they love to have those on their shelves. And you know, we have something called a brag shelf. Do you understand what that means? It's a shelf of just your books or the books you're in. So people go in and go, oh, that's an interesting shelf. You say, oh, yeah, those are my books, and it's called a brag shelf. And so people love to see all the foreign editions and the different printings on the shelf. And sometimes that's more important than the money, just to get a nice edition of a book out there. And a couple of years ago, I had a Brazilian publisher contact me during the COVID times, and they were a comic book publisher, and they wanted to do a couple of books of mine. One was the young adult book, and one was the Mammoth Book of Vampires. And both books look fabulous. I mean, both were hardcovers. Both books look beautiful, and particularly the vampires one. They did such a great job on. It's actually the Mammoth Book of Vampire Stories by Women. It was the one they did, and that's all stories by female writers, because I felt that I was doing.
It's
there weren't
great. That
enough
book
female
is
writers.
great. That book
Yeah.
is great.
Thank you. Well, the reason I did it was because I felt that we weren't bringing enough female writers into horror. When I started out, there were very few. I mean, I know you've interviewed Lisa Tuttle, who was one of the few female writers at
Yes.
that time. So I said, no, I want to do a book, and it's just all women writing horror. And at that time, most women writers were writing vampire stories. So it was a no-brainer to say, okay, let's do just one big book with all these women writing their horror stories. And that book is still successful today. It's still good. But it's because they did a great job on the book. I'm very proud of that book. On the shelf, it looks beautiful. And as I said, that's what I'm interested in. I love beautiful books, and you know, if they're going to have my name on them, I want them to look as lovely as possible, and read as lovely as possible as well.
Amazing.
How do
Okay,
you... Perdón, Pablo, ¿querías preguntar algo?
no. Go ahead.
How do you choose the order of the stories?
Well, going back to my analogy of it like a movie, I edit the book as if I was editing a film or a TV show. So you have, let's say, 14 stories, 12 or 14 stories. Some are physical horror, as Paolo was saying earlier. You know, some are psychological horror. Some are vampire stories. Some are zombie stories. Some are what I like to call quiet horror, which is a term that my friend Charles L. Grant came up with. Quiet horror. So when we were talking off camera, Paolo, you were saying horror should be horror, and it's about fear. I kind of slightly disagree with that, because I don't think it should always be about fear, but it should be about an emotion, creating an emotion in the reader. It can sometimes be about making you nervous, make a feeling of unease, not necessarily all out horror.
Uncomfortable. Yes.
So for quiet horror, sometimes it's not that it's like, oh, in your face horror or blood and gore. Something happens maybe in a story which is creepy and a little off kilter, off beat, and then maybe a couple of days later you're doing something else, and it pops into your head, and you think, oh, that was weird, that was creepy, that was strange. And I love those stories. That's my favorite kind of horror, personally. So I have all these different stories. So the first thing you must make sure is you don't put the same kind of stories next to each other, unless it's a themed anthology, of course. And then even if it's a themed anthology, say vampire stories, you don't have the same kind of vampires next to each other. You break it up. So although the reader knows every story in the book is about a vampire, they may not know about what kind of vampire or what type of vampire. So it could be a science fiction story about a vampire. It could be a World War II story about a vampire. It could be a romance story about a vampire. So what you want to do is you want to create that what I call it's an arc. It goes up, it comes down, it goes up, it comes down. And that's how a film is put together, so that you have, as I said earlier, strong opening to bring you in, to make you keep reading or keep watching in the case of a film. Then maybe some quiet bits, then another, a jump or a scare, then maybe some other quiet bits, maybe another jump and a square, and you do that all the way through the book. And at the end, you want it, like in any film, you want a big climax where it all comes together and people go, wow, that's fantastic. Which is why a lot of my books end with a novella or a novelette, a longer story.
Yes.
Because by the time you've reached the end of the book, you're into it now. I don't want people to read my books by going to that story and then missing a couple and going to that story. And then I want people to start at the beginning and read right the way through to the end, because that's how the book is constructed to be read. Now, you can dip in and out, and that's fine if that's what you want to do. But that would be like watching a movie and just watching a little bit here and then spinning on and watching another little bit and then spinning on and watching another little bit. My books are all connected. So you start at the beginning, excuse me, and then they work like this all the way through. And the terror and the horror builds, and the atmosphere builds. And so hopefully by the time you get to the end of the book, you're like, oh, I just want to read the next story. I just want to read the next story. I want to see what happens. I want to see what's going on with this story. And so it's like being an editor, not only just being like a director, it's like being a film editor. And you say, okay, I'll take that bit and I'll take that bit, but I need to put something in between those to break those up so that it's not quite the same and similar atmosphere or word. And of course, the nice thing about an anthology, and it's something I'm very aware of, is because you're using different writers, the way they use vocabulary is different. It's a different style of writing, a different style of explaining things, a different style, just a cadence, the way people talk in the story. And I've had publishers who've come in and said, oh, we should edit all this so it all reads the same all the way through. And I say, no, that's not what I want. We can punctuate, make sure the punctuation is the same all the way through, but I want those different voices all the way through the book. So, if you've got this person writing a story about vampires and this person writing a story about vampires, they're very, very different types of stories when you're reading them, because the voice that is telling you the story is very different. So you don't want to homogenize those. You don't want to level them all out. I want those different voices, those different ways of telling a story, because I think that's what good storytelling is all about. It's the voice of the author. And I think it's very sad, I think Paolo might agree with me now, that a lot of people who are working in horror don't have a voice anymore. They don't have when you read H.P. Lovecraft or you read M.R. James, they're very, very different writers. They're telling pretty much the same kind of story. They're telling a story, about ghosts or horror or whatever, but they're very, very different. Now everything reads the same. It's like a school essay. It's just all flat. And I try to, and the other thing is when I'm doing and editing a story, I actually edit the story as I read it. And then if I make any changes, I send that back to the author and say, look, I've changed your story. I've done this. And it's, I've changed this. I've done this. Go through it. Tell me if there's anything you disagree with. If there's anything you want to change back or you want to change in a different way. I work with my authors. I don't just accept stories because I don't think that's what being an editor is. That's being a compiler. You are just compiling stories. But when and obviously if you're doing reprints, you haven't got much choice. But if you're doing new fiction, I think it's very important that the editor works with the writer to get the best story for both of us. And so I work very closely with my writers. In fact, I have some writers who send me a first draft and say, okay, here's the first draft, Steve. Tell me what you want me to do with this. And sometimes there's no ending. Sometimes they say, okay, tell me what kind of ending you want on this story. And I'll go back with them and say, well, we could do this or we could do this and work around. So I'm a very hands-on editor. I know there's a lot who aren't, and that's fine. Everybody has a different way of working. But I work very closely with my authors. And to be honest, as I said, I'm not a great writer in that respect, but I am a great plotter. I can plot. When I used to work in movies, I could plot things out very, very well. I'm a very good story editor. So I'm very good at doing that. And I would say in 9 out of 10 cases, the authors come back to me and never change anything. They say, that's great, Steve. You made it better. Just run it like that. And we do. That's how we publish the story. And that's how that story then appears in other books and other collections and goes on. So what I'm basically doing is making them look better. And by making them look better, they make me look better. That's what I can ask for.
Let me say that after your sharing of this absolutely mesmerizing way of doing, you are, when I was listening to you, I was thinking that suddenly appeared in my mind the image of these old tailors of Savile Row inclined on the table doing a patchwork with this saw, but a climbing saw, because it's a saw, but you have to going up and going up and going up to keep the attention of the reader. So I almost felt your joys and your rejoice of doing that, because it's like a orchestra conductor or even a cook that doing your magic in order to accomplish a book that is like a brick in the middle of the head. And this idea of the tailor with the piece of chalk and the scissors, cutting there, putting there, going down, going up, and going to the files and said, oh, this Mr. say that, blah, 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 going back to the, and so on and so on. And the confidence of your writers in your good sense, your good taste, and your experience. So let me say, Steve, that for me was a really mesmerized sharing of your work, and I learned a lot.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I've never been compared to a cook before, but I can see the analogy. That's very good. I can see the idea of a patchwork and putting it all together and sewing it together, kind of like Dr. Frankenstein putting a body together. It's kind of what I'm doing. And also, as I say, I've been doing this now, even semi-professionally, since the early 1970s. And as you probably can tell from my loudness and enthusiasm, I'm still having as much fun doing it now as I did back then. I still find this. I find horror the most fascinating of genres because it works in any other genre. As I mentioned earlier, you can have a romance horror story, a war horror story, a science fiction horror story. Horror is that one emotion, whether it's fear or trepidation or whatever we want to call it, which works in all the other literary genres. And in that respect, I think it's probably not only one of the most important genres of fiction, but it's also one of the most overlooked and looked down upon genres. And I don't mind that. I mean, Ramsey Campbell and I have both said in our careers, horror goes up, it's popular for a few years, then it goes down and crime is popular, and then crime goes down and romance comes up and whatever. And I've described it before, it's like a wheel that slowly turns. And about every 8 years, horror comes back again, and it's hot again because of a movie or a TV show like Stranger Things or something. So suddenly it's hot again, and then the wheel turns and it's something else becomes hot. But during all those times when horror is not on top, Ramsey Campbell and myself and others have carried on doing horror. We've not changed. We've not gone off to do another genre like a lot of authors do. And we've always insisted on having the word horror on the spines of our books. We don't have dark fantasy or dark romance or all these other words they come up with trying to pretend it's not horror. I've always been a horror guy. I guess from now I'll always be a horror guy. That's all I've got.
But in your long career, how many times do you hear about the death of the horror genre?
I've never done that. I've always been positive about everything. When I'm giving talks, when I'm doing, I've done workshops. I've gone to schools, talked to children in schools. I try to be as positive about the genre as I can. Maybe in my heart, I'm not as positive. And as I said earlier, I see publishing, not just horror, but all publishing is. I don't know whether our time has come. Maybe it's got another 10 years, maybe it's got another 20 years. But I'm not even sure we'll have books in the way we know them in 20 years' time. That won't worry me. I won't be around in 20 or 30 years' time. But I think it would be very sad if books died out because people were on their phones or tablets or had things implanted in their heads. They were seeing pictures. I predicted some years ago that books would slowly die out. But I expected it not to be for another 50 or 60 years. And it has moved much, much faster than I could ever imagine. So I try to bring up the enthusiasm and the excitement and the love, just the pure love of books. And it just so happens I'm a horror guy. It could have been, something else. It could have been science fiction. It could have been fantasy. It could have been anything. And I still read in those genres. I still enjoy those genres. But I work in horror mostly. And that's what appeals to me. I love zombies. I love vampires. I love waking up with werewolves in the morning. It's great.
Excellent.
Pablo, te pido que le traduzcas esta pregunta. Él ha hablado, Stephen Jones ha hablado de cómo se maneja con los distintos contribuidores en sus antologías, pero supongo que en algún momento ha tenido que reject some story. ¿Cómo se maneja a ese punto? Si es que ha tenido que rechazar alguna historia.
Fernando wants to know that after a long career, maybe you were in the position to reject some work or some author, and he wants to know how do you deal with this situation, and because it's not funny, but even
okay. Well, that's a very good question. Very good question. I've always said that the skill of being a good editor is not what you accept, it's what you reject. That's what makes a book good. Because too many people, as I mentioned earlier, don't edit a book, they just compile a book. They just put a bunch of stories together. They don't put them in any real order. They just throw them into a book, put it out there, hope it sells. Now, the problem, of course, is the more you know these people in the genre, the more they are your friends. You go out to dinner with them or go to the pub with them or go to conventions with them. It becomes much more difficult to reject their work if it's not up to standard. But it's something you have to do. I mean, I've rejected friends' stories. I've rejected, people who I adore. I mean, people who I look up to, who are my heroes, because the stories just weren't good enough. And I think, as an editor, I think that's your responsibility. That's why your name is on that book. I remember there was a time back in the 1980s where people like Stephen King, nobody would reject a Stephen King story. It could be the worst Stephen King story in the world, but if you got a Stephen King story, you were told you had to accept it. And a good example of this is I was talking to a publisher a couple of years ago, and they wanted me to do some anthologies for them. And I've worked with them before on other books. And they said, okay, we want you to do these anthologies, Steve, but we want you to include this writer, this writer, this writer, and this writer. And I said, no, that's not how I do my anthologies. I don't do an anthology based on the names that are in that book. Every anthology I've ever done is based on the quality of the stories. And if it just so happens Ramsey Campbell is in there, or Stephen King is in there, or somebody else is in there, Peter Straub, or whoever it would be, that's fine. That's because they sent a really good story. But I am not going to accept a job where you're making me just pick these names because they're the hot names at the moment. They're the big names at the moment. Because guess what? One day they won't be the big names anymore. And the book will still be out there. So the book has to be better than the names. Now, it is difficult, so you have to be very diplomatic in how you do it, and you have to be, also generous and honest. So, I'm never rude to people unless they're rude to me. I try to explain to them why I'm turning a story down, what the reasons are, or even how to make it better. I've just done this with a story in the last couple of weeks. An author who I've worked with over the years, and who's actually been in the business longer than I have, sent me a story, and it's an interesting story. It's a nice story, but he said, it's not really a horror story, Steve. And I said, well, let me read it and I'll get back to you. And I read it, and it was a beautifully written story, but it wasn't really a horror story. And I went, okay, no, you're absolutely correct. It's not a horror story, but I'll tell you how to make it a horror story if you want. He said, if you would, yeah, please. And I said, okay. So I wrote a page of notes on it, and a new ending. I said, look, this is what you need to do. You need to put these beats in here, and this is your ending. Keep the same, it's even got the same title, because the title works for it as it would be. He went away, he wrote the story, he sent it to me last week. I read it, I bought it for the new anthology. It was as simple as that. So sometimes you can work with the author, and sometimes say to them, but it was very obvious sometimes that it's just something they've had in their bottom drawer, and they've just thrown it out there in the hope you'll publish it. They'll make some money. And in which case you have to say, I'm sorry, it's not suitable for what I'm doing for whatever reason. But try and be honest. Try and be as upfront as you can be. And again, because I'm very honest in my reactions, if I love something, I really, really love it. And if I hate it, I really, really hate it. So that's the way people react to me, and it works because I'm not going to be there and giving you platitudes and saying, oh yes, you're the greatest writer in the world, or it's lovely, it's fabulous, you should win awards, or if I will also turn around and say, no, I don't think so, mate, I don't think you've really worked hard enough at this one, you've got to work a bit harder, or send me something else. And I've had a few people, not many, I would say a handful, 5 at most, who have taken offense at me turning down their story over the years. But usually and you'll appreciate this, Paolo, usually it's because they're new and young and don't like being rejected. I can't believe they've been rejected because they're geniuses. Whereas the older, more experienced writers are used to it. And when I knew people like Hugh B. Cave and Manny Wade Wellman and Fritz Leiber and Robert Bloch, they were used to being turned down all the time by the pulp magazines. And, as Robert Bloch told me once, you would aim at the best, highest paying market. And if you didn't sell to them, you would send that story to the next market and then the next market. And eventually it would find a market. Maybe instead of 3 cents a word, it would be 1 cent a word. But when you sent your next story out, you would send it to the highest market again and hope it didn't quite get down and you got paid 2 cents a word this time. And so you knew you were getting better and you knew you were hitting better markets. And as I said earlier, we don't pay a lot of money for anthologies. The money's not there anymore. It's not even there like it used to be back in the 80s and 90s. So it's more about people getting exposure in anthologies, getting people learning who they are, which is why I always write introductions to the stories. If you look at my anthologies, and I'm sure you know this when you've seen the anthologies, there's always a piece about the author and other things they've done, because it's very important that if somebody reads that story and enjoys it, I want them to go and look for other stories or other books by that same author. So it's a way of saying, well, look, I can't really pay you a huge amount of money, but I can promote you as well. I can promote you, I can promote your story and whatever. And people seem to like that. The authors seem to like that. I enjoy doing those little biographies anyway. It's something I seem to be quite good at. And it's a way of it's another way of paying back the writers, to be honest. And so, yeah, it is difficult, but you just have to pull your trousers up, tighten your belt, and be honest with people. And hopefully they respect your honesty and they respect your opinion and go, okay, Steve, that's fine. When I've got another story, I'll send you that and see what you think of that one. And that's fine with me. I'm happy with that.
I got a question.
Yeah.
I would like to ask Steve, if I may, that you said that your kind of standard if the manuscript is good enough or not.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, according to your experience, beyond, of course, the basic stuff that a good story have to in structure, tension, and according to your sense of smell, if I may say, what have to have a story to be good enough according to Steve Jones?
That's easy. It's something I told the children when I go to schools. I talk to them about this very much. There are basically 3 things. All right. So you can get a story that is beautifully written. I mean, the writing, the sentence construction, the use of words and language can be absolutely fabulous. And it's the most boring story in the world. It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have a middle. It doesn't have an end. A character starts off here at the beginning of the story and ends up here at the end of the story. Nothing happens to them. They don't change, whatever. But the writing can be beautiful. Then also, you can get a story which really tells a great plot. Often, if it's possible, they'll do something different with an idea. They'll take a vampire story and do something different with it. They'll take a zombie story, they'll do something different with it. They'll do a serial killer story, they'll do something different with it. That, of course, as an editor, is what you're always hoping for. Is something original, something new. There aren't any new ideas, but there's new ways of telling the old ideas, if you see what I'm saying. So there's always a way of coming up with a new way to tell an old story. And sometimes I just don't think people think before they start writing. And the question an author should ask themselves is, why does this story exist? What is the point of me writing this story? If it's just like a Stephen King story that he's written before, what's the point? Stephen King can do it better. So you have those two things. Now, I'll often get a story which is like, wow, I've never seen that before. That's really interesting. But the writing is terrible. I'll also get beautifully written stories where I just don't care about the characters or the plot or anything else about it. So what I'm looking for, to answer your question, is a story that has both great ideas and great writing together. That you bring those two things together, and that's the kind of story that I'll be looking for and more likely to publish. The other thing, and this is not being arrogant, but it's something I've learned, is I can normally tell if a story is going to be any good by the title. Because if somebody has spent enough time thinking about the title of their story, it means the chances are they've thought about the writing of the story or the plotting of the story. If somebody sends me a story and it's called The Vampire Story, I'm going to guess it's not going to be very interesting. If it's something a bit more interesting, because I always think, again, like the title of a book or the cover of a book, the title of a story is what should drag you in to begin with. It's like, that sounds interesting. I want to, that's why so many people use quotes from Shakespeare as story titles, because of the language, of the vision, of the imagery. So I can often tell, and I've done that a lot of times. I've changed titles of stories. I said, okay, if we've changed that, we've done that. Now let's change the title of the story because you need a much better title on this story. This is not good enough for this story. So all those three things need to come together: the title, the quality of the writing, and the plotting of the story itself. And if you've got all those three things, and as I say, I can add to that. We can change some of it. We can always up it, but you need those three things. And I see I don't read as much as I used to now, but I used to see so many things which were like, well, I used to call them what I did on my holiday stories. And it's like when you're a kid and you go back to school after the vacation and you write a thing like, I went away on holiday and I went to the seaside and I had a lovely time with my parents and it was fabulous. And there's nothing there. It's just a straight line of like narrative. And I used to see these stories, and then the end line would be something, and then he turned out to be a vampire. And it's like, really? That's your big ending? It's like, no, you're not going to get in. You're not going to get in. So, yeah, those are the three things I look for in a story. They're the three things that when they all come together, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And I'm happy as an editor because I filled, a few more 1,000 words in my book. They're happy because I pay them and they get a lovely book out of it. And the publisher's happy because I can deliver a book and get on to the next one. So everybody's happy.
Very, very enlightening. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Fer.
Pablo, paso a la pregunta 9. Según tenemos entendido, Stephen Jones ha oficiado como publicista de la película Hellraiser. Si esta información es correcta, quisiéramos saber cómo fue su experiencia.
Let me find my little friend over here.
I've got an original one of those downstairs. An original.
Yeah.
From the film.
Do you have the original?
I've got one of the original ones from Hellraiser 2.
Oh, that's...
I've got one of the original boxes that Professor Chenard had. If you remember the scene, he had different boxes under glass display cabinets. And he picked one up and he throws it across the room. I have that one. They gave when we finished the film on Hellraiser 2, they gave the special effects people gave me the box, the original box, which is beautiful because it's made out of wood and that's real copper, creating those. So it's all handmade. It's beautiful. And then if you remember Hellraiser 3, which I also worked on, I worked on the first 3 Hellraisers, the Pillar of Souls, which is a big thing that Pinhead comes back in and it blows up in the club and he's released. I have one of the corners of the Pillar of Souls that was part of the original one, which I brought back from America when we finished the film, because it was just going to be thrown away. So if you look at any of the photos, there's like a long face carved on the four corners of the pillar. I've got one of those as well. Yeah.
Oh, dear Lord in heaven.
I'm a
Bueno,
big film collector. I've got hundreds of thousands of posters, press books, movie stills, all of that stuff. I've been collecting. I collect too many things. I collect everything.
how
Yeah,
how do
yeah.
you experience working with Hellraiser films was?
I began as a well, no, I didn't begin. I began as an editor, but I worked in the 1990s a lot as a film reviewer and a film journalist. So I for magazines. I worked for Cine Fantastique and Starburst, Famous Monsters of Filmland for Forry Ackerman, who was a friend of mine. And I would go on set and I would interview actors or directors or whatever, and I'd do set reports. And I write them up, and we get photos, and we'd put them together as articles, and I would sell those. And one day I was in Hollywood, and I was visiting my friend Dennis Etchison, the great short
Yes.
story writer.
Great,
And
great
Dennis
writer.
was a friend with, well, one of the best. I mean, literally one of the best short horror story writers in the world ever. No longer with us, sadly, but he was a great friend. And when I was in Los Angeles, I used to stay at his house and stay with him. And he was a great friend with John Carpenter, the director. And he said, would you like to interview John? Because he's just finishing up his latest film at 20th Century Fox. And I said, sure, that'd be great. I'd love to interview John Carpenter. So he arranged it. Dennis arranged it. I went out to 20th Century Fox. He drove me out there. And John Carpenter was finishing up work on Big Trouble in Little China at that time, which is a fun fantasy film,
Yes.
kung fu,
Yes.
silly but fun film. And we had a great time. We did the interview. It was terrific. He was terrific, and I've met him since. And John Carpenter is always terrific. And then afterwards, he said, "Well, why don't you guys come to lunch? In the canteen, 20th Century Fox canteen." And we said that would be great. So he took us to lunch, ordered us lunch, and we were chatting. And during the conversation, John Carpenter turned to me and he said, "Look, Steve," he said, "you've got this experience in television and stuff in England," because I said I used to work for a television company making shows. He said, "You're a writer and you've been writing for years now. Have you ever thought of coming out to America and making movies?" And I said, "No." Basically, you've got too many people out here trying to make movies as it is. They're much better connected than I am. I would be a very small fish in a very big pond if I came out to Hollywood to make movies. And he said, "Well, have you ever thought then of combining those skills and working as a unit publicist on a movie?" And I went, "No, I haven't. That's never occurred to me." He said, "Well, because you know how films are made and how television is made and how films are made, and because you can write and know all that," he said, "you would be perfect as a unit publicist." I thought, interesting. So when I got back to London, I picked up the phone and phoned my friend Clive Barker, who was living in London at the time. And I said, "Clive, you're making some shitty little horror film, aren't you, for no money? Do you have a unit publicist?" And Clive said, "No, Steve, we can't afford one. We haven't got enough in the budget to afford a unit publicist." I said, "Well, I'll do it for free. I'll take 3 months off my job and I'll come and do it." He said, "Well, that would be great." He said, "But let me talk to my producer," who was a gentleman called Christopher Figg. He said, "Let me talk to my producer and see what he thinks." So he obviously called Christopher Figg. Chris Figg set up a meeting with me in London when we went to a wine bar and went downstairs and drank wine and chatted. And by the end of the first bottle of wine, I had the job. I not only had the job, he said, "And you're not doing it for free. We will pay you the minimum wage that we can afford to pay." I said, "We don't have to." He said, "No, we're going to do that. We will pay you the minimum wage and you will be the unit publicist on Hellraiser 1. And that was great. And the lovely thing is, I live in North London and they filmed it literally 3 stops away from me on the underground tube train. So I could just get up in the morning, get on the tube, and in 3 stops, I would be on location at where Hellraiser was filmed. And I thought all films would be like that, but they weren't. And then after that, they invited me back to do Hellraiser 2, Nightbreed, Hellraiser 3, and then other companies starting using me. And I did films like Split Second with Rutger Hauer and Last Gasp with Robert Patrick and all sorts of little movies. And there was that period at the beginning of the 1990s, I think up to about 1994, 95, where I was doing 2 or 3 movies a year. And it was great. I enjoyed it. And I also did what's called an EPK, an electronic press kit, which is like a video documentary, behind the scenes documentary. Because of my experience in television, I knew how to use a camera or how to hire a crew, how to direct. So I would make these featurettes for these films as well, which would then go out to TV stations when they were released. They were meant to be released as little documentaries, because in those days there was no such thing as DVDs or Blu-rays. Nowadays, this stuff is gold dust if you can find this material. So, for example, Nightbreed is coming out in a new box set probably next year now. And I actually had the material I shot back in 1989 behind the scenes. And they've allowed me to put that together into an 1 and 10-minute long documentary that's going to be on the Blu-ray of stuff you've never seen behind the scenes before, of interviews with all the cast and crew, including David Cronenberg and Doug Bradley and Clive Barker and all these people. And it's like, this should have been done in 1989, 1990, and it's finally going to come out in 2027. And that was great fun. And the thing was, it got to a point where the books took over. And I was doing so many books, I didn't have time to do the films anymore. And so I was offered a couple of movies which I had to turn down. I was offered The Saint with Val Kilmer in Moscow to go and do that. I said, I just haven't got the time. I've got too many books to do. I've got Best New Horror to do. I have to read all these manuscripts and things. And so that kind of went away eventually. And I just stayed with the books, and that's how it happened. But I'm very proud, because I always think Hellraiser 1, Hellraiser 2, and Hellraiser 3 are like Frankenstein, the Bride of Frankenstein, the Son of Frankenstein. They're the good ones. They're the really good ones, you know. I loved working on Nightbreed. I thought Nightbreed was a terrific experience. The version I worked on was, when I saw a rough cut with Clive, it was over 2 hours long. It was epic. It was a truly epic monster movie. And then when I saw it at the 20th Century Fox Theatre with the press, I turned to the person I was with. I said, "What happened to the first 20 minutes of that film? They just cut the first 20 minutes out of the movie." And they cut a lot more as well. But all the movies I picked, like the books I do, I chose for a reason, because it was an actor I wanted to work with, or it was filmed in Los Angeles, when I did a couple in Los Angeles. There's always a reason why I would do that movie. And the other thing I did was I brought that same ethos to what I did. So I would say, well, I know you haven't got a lot of money, but we could do this. We could do T-shirts or jackets or badges. On Hellraiser, we did little badges that said "There are no limits," because that was what Clive had decided was going to be the tagline. And when people came down to the set, and I brought press down to the set all the time, TV crews, reporters, lots of them friends of mine who work for the same magazines that I work for. We would give them a T-shirt and a badge and all this kind of stuff. So they went away happy, and they would write nice things about the film and whatever. And I also wrote press notes. What used to happen was you wouldn't get press notes until 2 weeks before the film came out. Well, I would give people press notes when they came down, the film was being shot. So they had all that information months in advance of the film coming out. So we really revolutionized the way publicity was done for movies. But from a writing standpoint more than anything else, so that they could do the best possible stories. I would get people, if they would give me the cover of a magazine, I would give them an exclusive photo to put on the front of that magazine. And it got to a point where the companies were asking me to come up with ideas for the movie posters and photographs for the movie posters. I rewrote bits of the script sometimes. I would go into the editing showings with the director and they would turn to me and say, well, Steve, what do you think of that? Should we change that? So, I was like working behind the scenes in all these different ways, all these different capacities. And it was fascinating. It was really, really great. And as I say, I'm very proud. And nowadays, of course, I do commentaries on Blu-rays. Myself and Kim Newman, we do maybe, I mean, Kim does a lot more than I because I haven't got the time again. But I'll probably do something like 8 to 10 films a year where we talk about the movies and about the history of the movies and things like that. And we've been doing that since the mid-1990s. And that's become a second career with me. I now do lots and lots and lots of Blu-ray commentaries, which then get ported over all over the world onto other versions. So in a way, that's kind of what I was doing with the movies. But no, I'm very, very proud of the Hellraiser movies. And I still think they stand up very well today. I mean, they look a bit dated, and they are a bit dated, 1980s and early 90s. But I still think back in the day, they were very cutting edge. They were really interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, it's just it's part of my history, part of my horror history, which I'm just proud of. That's all.
Yeah, amazing.
My last question, Pablo, es acerca de la literatura africana, literatura latinoamericana. Si ha podido leer algo de literatura, horror literature from Africa, Latinoamérica, si es que está siendo publicada en el UK.
Fernando would like to know if Latin American, African, and so many regions of around the world are published in the UK, and if you have notice of what is cooking over here or over there. Anyway, that's...
No, I understand. Yeah. No, I've got to say they're not well represented, particularly in short stories. I mean, occasionally a novel will come through where they have been showcased, let's say, is you'll find somebody who is maybe African American who will put together an anthology of just African American writers. Or again, with Latin America, you will find somebody who will, like Silvia Garcia Martinez, who will put together something, which is basically Latin American writing. And I think that's great. But that hasn't crossed over into mainstream horror that I've seen. I mean, there might be the odd writer here or there. It's interesting. We don't have a lot of black writers in horror, for example, of any nationality in this country. And you don't see many black horror fans at conventions, literary conventions. You will see them at film conventions, but not at whatever. It's just not really... I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but it's true of other countries as well. I mean, I don't see a lot of Italian stories. I don't see a lot of German stories. Right. It tends to stay very much within it. I mean, America, England, Australia, there is movement between all three of those. One, I guess, because we all speak English, so that helps, obviously. Although that's not necessarily true anymore because, I travel quite widely. I was in Spain recently. I was in Italy recently. All the young people speak English now. Everybody speaks English. So that barrier shouldn't be there, but it still is. It still is, and it is a barrier. So I would like to say it has broken, but it hasn't. I mean, I see very little from those people. And sometimes it's because the way the translation works. I mean, I've used translated stories in my books. And you've got to have a really good, sympathetic translator who understands both the English version and not just translate it, but understands what's behind the language, yes, and can almost interpret it. You may know this better than I do, Paolo, but they can interpret it so that that's what the author was saying, but this is the way you would say it in English, not just translate it like AI translates now, or Google. So I think it's very important to get a good translator. I'm not adverse to reading stories from other countries by other authors. It's just something that doesn't come my way that often, to be honest. And I think it's interesting. It doesn't go the other way. I mean, as I said, although I've sold books to many other countries over the years, I don't sell that many in translation anymore. It's basically they've got homegrown writers now. Why do they need translations of British writers or American writers when they've got their own up and coming writers? I know I've just been working with a Spanish publisher, and they're bringing out, and you just mentioned him, Dennis Etchison's collection, The Dark Country, which is coming out in Spanish for the first time. And that's going to be it's a fabulous, fabulous collection of stories. It's probably Dennis's best. And the publisher and the translator really, really wanted to do it. So we've helped them and got that organized for them. And I think that's coming out the end of this year or beginning of next year. And that's going to be a really interesting book, because it'd be lovely to see Dennis's work find a new market. So it's a two-way street sometimes. I would like to see more of my stuff go out that way, and I'd like to see more stuff come back the other way. But there are people who are experts at that, as I say, who know about African literature or Latin American literature. It's just not me. I'm not an expert at that. I'm not really an expert at anything. I just do what I want to do, and hopefully it works out.
Oh yeah, my last question is in relation with your answer. I would like to ask, if I may, if you find any kind of difference between American, when I say American, I say USA horror, and the UK horror.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%. There, you can tell the difference, and I'll tell you the way you can tell the difference is the stories that I used to pick for Best New Horror and the stories that Ellen Datlow used to pick for her Best Horror Stories books. The crossover was very, very little. Ellen, who is basically the American version of me, and I'm the American and British version of Ellen, and we're good friends. We're not rivals. We're very good friends. We've known each other for many, many years. Her version of horror and my version of horror are very different. Very, very different. Now, sometimes you'll get writers, Dennis Etchison, Carl Wagner, Charles L. Grant, Peter Straub, Thomas Tessier, these kind of people who understand European horror. Jonathan Carroll, these kind of people, and they understand the European, I'm not going to say British, but European mentality. And even though they're American, their stories are much more interesting, more rounded. I find a lot of American writers just write American stories about Americans. There are much big differences. I mean, David J. Scow, for example, is a terrific, terrific writer who writes a lot of stories about being American or being in Hollywood or whatever. Dennis, as I said, was a great writer of American horror stories, but he just had a worldview that took his fiction in a whole different way. So I think there is a big difference. I used to read a lot of American collections and anthologies when I was doing Best New Horror, and I would say, what was the point of that? What was the point? Okay, so you've written a story or you've written a book, but it was pointless. It was just like, you just did it because you could, but you haven't added anything to the genre. You haven't added anything to our field. You haven't really done anything. All you've done is basically run very fast to stand still. Then you look at somebody like Ramsey Campbell, and there is nobody else in the world who writes like Ramsey Campbell unless they're trying to write like Ramsey Campbell. He is probably the most quintessential British horror writer I know next to M.R. James. I'm not a big fan of the classics. I mean, I've read Dracula, I've read Frankenstein, I've read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I actually like The Picture of Dorian Gray better than all of those. But I find them a bit of a slog. I don't find M.R. James a slog. I don't find H.P. Lovecraft a slog. I enjoy both their writing. And that's because, well, H.P. Lovecraft, was an Anglophile. He wanted to be a British an old British gentleman. And so he came very much from that kind of background. So yeah, I do see a big, big difference. So when I'm putting together an anthology, I do try to mix up the nationalities and don't, because you can tell. I mean, I'm very lucky. I work with a lot of very, very good American writers, but of course, they're people I've been working with for years in many cases, who know what I want in the first place. People like Lisa Morton, for example, who is somebody I've been working with for 40 years, who is a terrific, terrific writer and knows exactly how to pitch a story to me. Linda E. Rucker, another great female writer from America. And Michael Marshall Smith, who's British and now lives in America. Peter Atkins, who is British and now lives in America. So it goes back and forth, and their fiction does change when they're they've become embedded in American society. So their views and their vocabulary and everything has changed over the years. But you can still find new writers. We've just recently discovered a writer called Mia Dahlia, and she's got a story in both. She's got a story in both my new anthologies and in my next upcoming anthology, and she's been pretty much small press published up to this point. And so again, I'm hoping by her exposure in my books that will lift her career a little bit and make it a little bit, put her on the map for other editors and other publishers and whatever. And so yeah, I think there absolutely is a difference, and I think the same difference applies. African fiction, Latin American fiction, Australian fiction again is very different to American and British fiction in horror. And there are some people who can write and match the market, and there are others. It's a totally different kind of story. And and again, it could just come down to something as simple as vocabulary and how we describe different things. It still amuses me that a lift is something American has in their shoes to make themselves look taller, and in this country a lift is an elevator in America. So, you have these things where as an editor, you have to go through and tidy all that kind of stuff up. But yeah, overall, I would say, yeah, there is a difference. And you've got to be aware of that difference. That's why I have a sign next to my desk, which has been here for nearly 50 years. And it says, but again, it's something I tell classes when I teach in classes. To know where you are, you have to know where you've been. Which means you have to read backwards to go forwards. So you can't just come in and say, oh, the last good horror film ever made was A Nightmare on Elm Street 6. You've got to go back and watch the old black and white movies. You've got to know about the Universal films. You've got to know about Val Lewton. You've got to know about all Hammer. You can't, and it's the same with literature. If you haven't read Richard Matheson, you can't say, I've come up with this great idea where the world is ruled by vampires and there's just one human left. Because that's a fantasy, and nobody's ever done that before. And it's like, well, if you've read I Am Legend, you would know it has been done before. Because as I said at the very beginning of this interview, everything has been done before. It's just the way it's done is what makes it interesting and new and dynamic. And so I tell everybody, go back and read M.R. James, read Lovecraft. Even if you don't like them, read them so you know what not to do when you're writing a story, because it's already been done. Or you're inspired enough to say, I love that. What can I do in that vein that's different, but still in that vein? That's why I did, the Shadows over Innsmouth anthologies, because they were set in Lovecraft's world, but they did very different things the way Lovecraft would have written them. So you're always looking for that different way. But the only way as a writer you're going to get that is by going back and reading the classics, going back and reading beforehand. Read the old stuff. You don't have to like it, but it will teach you enough that you know where you're going going forward with your career. And I think that's very important.
Indeed. You know, I'm a member of the um, horror writer American
Yeah,
Society.
HWA, Horror Writers Association. I won their Grand Master Award a few years ago, so I'm now an honorary member for life.
Yes. Right now, I was distinguished or not because it's a very uh, hard weight to my shoulder as reader of the proposal of Bram Stoker Award. And reading the proposals, the manuscript, uh, many of them, of course, are really good written, and others are, well, you know,
I know.
but it's quite difficult for me to find something refresh, something really fresh, not because everything was written, already written, but just the new flavor, the new approach to the same story, because we are always telling the same story. But it's quite difficult because they are too much like you know, under a sphere of the same story of the small town or the haunted house or the ghost main
The evil child, all of that stuff. Yeah.
yeah. So they are good stories, but I already read thousands of times.
So are you on the juries? You're one of the juries.
Yeah.
For short fiction?
Yeah. No.
Okay, because a lot of my writers have submitted stories this year from new writings in horror and supernatural. But if you want to contact me on email afterwards, I can send you a PDF of the book, which you can read. And there's a lot of different things in that, I tell you. New things.
All right. Good. Because I really appreciate something fresh.
Well, see what you think. You can always be honest with me. It's fine.
All right. All right. All right. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Una cosita que quería agregar. Dennis Etchison Books of Stories was published last month in Spain.
Oh, last month it's come out. I haven't seen
with
it
the
yet. Okay.
with the title País de Tinieblas. Read Dennis Etchison. He's a great writer. Read Dennis Etchison.
Carl Edward Wagner said he was the greatest short story writer in the horror genre. And I think, to be honest with you, I think that's true.
Yes,
All right.
I agree.
And it's, you know, it's, we would like to keep talking with you because you gave us a real generous, open masterclass of not only the genre, but how to deal with the genre. That is the part that nobody sees, because you have the author, you have the public, but there is somebody in the middle of the change that have to put the whole puzzle together. And you open your heart, your experience, your sense of smell of what gonna be successful or not. Nobody knows, but you know, this could be, this could not be. And but anything has to finish. So we used to finish our interview asking, what are you up to?
That would be as long as the interview has already been. I'm always working on multiple books. At the moment, God, let me think what I'm working on at the moment. I'm working on this big art book about horror comics from the 1950s through to the 1980s, which will be coming out in 2 years' time. Full color. It's very, very good. I'm doing it with a friend of mine called Barry Forshaw, who is as big a comic fan as I am. We both have. I told you I collect a lot of things. I collect a lot of comics. So we've got big collections of horror comics, and we're putting all of that in the book. That's going to be beautiful. I'm working on the 4th volume of New Writings in Horror and the Supernatural for publication next year. Something I've been working on for 20 years will be coming out next year, which is a 3-volume set of weird tales, basically stories from weird tales. But the interesting thing is the middle volume, volume 2, and they'll be in different editions, but there will be one edition which is all 3 books in a slipcase. The middle edition is signed by Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Gahan Wilson, and a bunch of people who were in the original Weird Tales back in the day, because I got them to sign the sheet years ago, and we're putting this together. It's illustrated, and it's probably going to be 150,000 words, the 3 books together. That's going to be huge. And it looks beautiful. Their books look beautiful. That's coming out from PS Publishing next year. I'm also doing a second collection of horror stories by my friend Robert Silverberg, who is still with us. And Bob is one of the last of the 1950s science fiction writers now. And I did a book of his horror stories a couple of years ago, and we've got enough stories put together now that I can do a 2nd volume, so that's coming out as well. And there's a couple of other things I can't tell you about yet. But yeah, I try to keep busy. I did say when I turned 60, I said, that's it. I'm going to part retire. I'm going to half retire. I need to slow down. I need to take it easy. I've done enough. I've done everything I need to do. I'm going to take it easy when I turn 60. That was 12 years ago, and I'm busier than I've ever been. So I don't know. One day they'll find me slumped over this computer, still editing. That's the way I'll go, I'm afraid. Like Boris Karloff said, I want to go out while I'm still in harness, and I think I'll be the same. I'll still be editing. I'll still be reading. I'll still be watching movies. And one day I'll just keel over. That'll be it. But until then, I'm keeping busy. And that's why I'm grateful and thankful for keeping busy. And for people like you being interested. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks to you.
You did it great, sir. It's, you know who you are in the fandom of the horror, because without your anthologies, many of these good writers were lost in the marsh of anything, because there is too much people.
No, I mean, it's absolutely right. And now more so, there is so much stuff out there shouting for your attention every day. Everybody's shouting into the wind on, Twitter or X and Facebook and TikTok and everything, that all this stuff just gets lost. And so trying to bring material back. I remember my friend Ronald Chetwynd Hayes. He was a fun guy. He used to write lots of funny horror stories. They made some movies of his stories. And he said to me once, he said, Steve, all I hope for is when I'm dead and gone, and he is now, sadly, he said, when I'm dead and gone, all I hope for is in 30 years after I'm gone, some person is in a bookshop and they find a copy of one of my old books, pick it up and read it and enjoy it. And he said, in that case, everything I've done has been worthwhile. And as I said earlier, that's all I can hope for. But one day, I mean, you guys have been very kind. You've been very generous. You've been very polite about my career. Most people don't know who I am. Most people, I'm like the Wizard of Oz. I'm the man behind the screen that nobody ever sees. Ignore that man behind the screen. That's me. So I may know and may be comfortable with my position in horror, but most people don't know who I am or care, to be honest with you. So I appreciate the interest and the conversation and allowing me to put my views out there, because it's always nice when I can do that. So thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. We are the really honor of sharing your time your generosity and your open heart. So, Fernando, you wanna?
Nothing more to say except thanks for all your time and thanks for incredible anthologies. Thanks for you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, guys. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Steve, it was a really pleasure to meet you. Really, I
And
mean
likewise.
it with the bottom of my heart.
Really.
Good. Well, send me your email and we'll talk.
All right. Thank you
Right,
very
I'm going
much.
to go and get a drink now. I need a drink.
Oh, yeah. I'm planning to visit the UK, I guess, on January. Yeah, so
Well, let me
maybe.
know if you want to get together.
Of course.
Yeah. I'll give you some books.
Really. All right. Thank you
Take
very
care,
much.
guys. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.